I think what I would like is to ask Wynn to begin with something that he brought from Eugene. Would you do that prayer?
Yeah. Hello. Yeah, last night we were having a similar conversation, and I found myself wanting to open with a prayer that Eugene prayed, and I'd like to tell you why. So when I was doing the research for the biography, I went to Christ Our King Presbyterian, which was the church he pastored for almost 30 years in Bel Air, Maryland, and I was hoping to meet some of his parishioners and interview them, but also wanted to scrounge around in the church library and see what I could find. And I think if I remember right, I was hoping that I would find some of his sermon tapes. You know, the way churches, in the old days, you'd record it on the tape, and side A would be one Sunday and side B would be the next Sunday. And they sort of sent me to the room, this sort of dank room, and I was looking around, and sure enough, in one of the cabinets, there was boxes filled with old cassette tapes. And it was probably, 23, 24 years of sermons. And so I got these and I lugged them back. And another time I'm taking a trip back up to DC, and I'm driving in our 2004 Honda Pilot, which had almost 200,000 miles, was loud as heck. Everything was rattling. And I'm driving to DC, and it's just awful traffic and so much noise. And I didn't have a tape player. But when my mom died, she had an old Radio Shack tape player that I had snagged, and it barely worked. Like you would push play and it would whir, and I didn't have any way to play this tape. So I got one of those. I found somewhere in some old box an old adapter where you have, I don't even remember how it works, but you plug it in and something. And so if you ever think about a thin place, this is like the exact opposite of a thin place. I'm driving in this rattly car with semis flying by me. Everything's noisy. This recording is awful. It's like on top of the Radio Shack tape player barely working, and it's doing its scratchy thing. And I put in the first time I listened to one of these tapes, and a choir starts out, and to be honest with you, it was awful, screechy, and but then I heard Eugene's raspy voice, and he just said, "Let us pray." And I'm sitting there in my truck, and tears just immediately come. And I don't even know all the reasons why. I mean, some of it is just because I hadn't heard his voice in a while, and but I also think it was another one of those occasions where my heart was really hungry for God, and there are people that God puts in this world who see God and lead others to God. And so I'm driving down, and he says, "Let us pray," and he prays this prayer. And what I would discover is that Eugene prayed usually 2 prayers each Sunday that were extemporaneous pastoral prayers. Usually it was somewhere around the call to worship and then a moment of confession. But when you're hearing them, they don't sound like extemporaneous prayers. They sound like they're coming from a deep, deep well. So one of the projects I'm doing now is I'm gathering all these prayers together. And I wanted to pray this prayer, and I want to tell you why. Because I don't think there's anything that's truer to the heart of who Eugene was than prayer. And by prayer, what he would say is it's listening to and responding to God. And my hunch is that the reason we're having this conversation tonight is because most of us, or all of us, we're hungry to hear and respond to God. And so, and the other thing I want to say just before we even have this conversation is we're talking about Eugene, and that's a super weird thing to do, to be honest with you. I don't think Eugene would love that very much. I am now directing a center, helping to start a center that's called the Eugene Peterson Center for Christian Imagination. That's kind of dangerous, because everything about Eugene was, it's about God. So I also hope that we could just say that this evening, it's not really about Eugene. It's about that Eugene was a witness, and we want to be a witness too. And we want to give honor to the God who Eugene gave honor to. So I'd love to just pray this prayer that was Eugene's prayer. And I don't have my glasses. I think they're in here somewhere. God, we get hints and guesses at the true and the beautiful and the good. Brief openings into light-filled worlds have been given to us in smiles and greetings, in gifts this week. Shafts of joy stream into this shadowed and curtained creation. And then, quite unaccountably, we are plunged into obscurity again. We see through a glass darkly. We know in part. Help us to know even as we are known, as we worship Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Amen. That feels like an appropriate prayer for a conversation.
Thank you. So I was ordained to the ministry in 1984, and so I've been doing pastoral work for a long time. And I was born and raised in Colorado. Spent some time in the Northwest, about 15 years. But I feel like that my soul has been shaped to some degree by the geography and the topography of the state of Colorado. Why I'm drawn to the base of Mount Princeton, why I like to go backpacking and mountain climbing, and all of that. And I feel like the ancient church fathers, I think, said that nature is the second book of God. And I've really come to believe that we can learn a lot about who God is just by observing what's happening in the natural world. I know, because of reading your book, that Eugene would make a pilgrimage. I don't know if pilgrimage is the right word, but a trek across the country back to Montana every summer. How do you think that geography and the suburban life of Bel Air, how did these things intersect with his spiritual formations, and how did it impact his ministry?
Yeah, he talked about place a lot. It's why he felt a lot of resonance with Wendell-Berry. And I remember walking into their living room, and the living room was attached to the kitchen. And the kitchen, so their house is right on the lake. The little inlet, they call it the bay. I think they call it Hughes Bay, which is a bit generous, just a little. And then you look across Flathead Lake, and there's the Mission Range Mountains. And he would be standing, and I saw this multiple times. I've heard other people describe the same experience of he's standing there at the kitchen sink, looking out the window. So he's looking across the lake to these mountains, and he's just sitting there in rapt silence, and you didn't want to disturb him, but then you'd hear him say, I just love the sensuality of this place. And what I was struck by is he'd been looking at that same geography for basically his entire life. And yet it was never lost on him, on the grandeur. And he would see it all as grace. And at the beginning of the biography, if you've seen it, one of the first things you find is a map of Flathead Valley. And the reason that that's there is because you really can't understand Eugene without, to some degree, getting a sense of Flathead Valley. There was something about the cragginess of it, the wildness of it. That kind of language would seep into how he understood God, the wildness of God, the fact that God cannot be contained. And there's a lot of cultural things too. I mean, if there was anything that Eugene detested, and it was among pastors, it was among parishioners, it was among political people, pretense. If you were pretentious, he couldn't stand it. And I think some of that was his Montanan. He didn't, and yet he was stuck on the East Coast for his almost entire pastoral life. And it's really interesting that he talked about place a lot and belonging, but for a lot of his life, it was actually an act of like obedience, because he did not like Baltimore suburbs. There were many times in his journal, he would just talk about like, I can't believe that I'm stuck here, and yet he loved them too, and gave himself to that place. But I think his coming back to Montana every summer was an act of like staying sane and reconnecting to things that were true and a pace that was true. I think an interesting question is, how do we do this in a world where many of us don't have that kind of place? And so it raises interesting questions. But there is something about the discipline of submitting yourself to a place instead of fighting against it that I think was definitely a deep part of who he was.
And if I remember right, too, he was in the suburbs of Baltimore, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
Bel Air is a suburb, a lot of suburban tract homes, a lot of sameness. He had a certain level of contempt, not for the people, but for the area and what it was doing to the souls of the people, he thought. Am I right about that, or?
Yeah, I think that is right.
So almost like he was a missionary to that place.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I feel like in sort of the last 10 or 15 years, there's another kind of contempt for the suburbs that I hear a lot about. And I probably would want to follow up and say it wasn't that. It wasn't like, it was more of a combination of his soul belonged in the West, mixed with, I think, just some things about the commodification of people and communities and that he was really concerned about. Yeah.
So one of the things that's always blown me away is his towering intellect to be able to do what he's done, and prolific writer that he was, and also remain so earthy. He just seems like he's the guy, and I think you referred to this in the book, that he would go to his workshop and create some things, and he would work in the wood shop that he had. How does those two things kind of interplay with formations of his soul, do you think?
Well, Eugene always felt like he was an outsider. He never felt like he fit anywhere that he was. So when he was teaching at Regent, he would talk about how he felt like a fraud. He wasn't an academic like everybody else. And when he was in a pastoral setting, lots of pastors, he often felt like he didn't quite fit either, because he was having different concerns and seemed to be the prominent concerns. And so there was a sense of otherness. And I remember one time I wrote him, our relationship began through letters. And I asked him a question, and he talked about the need to, what was his words? Was to listen to your own counsel. And it was really interesting because he always talked about the importance of listening to others' wise counsel. But in this particular moment, he wanted to say something different, which was, there's times where you have to recognize the place God's put you in. And so his otherness led him to find ways where he could connect to things that were true in him. So his grandfather was a carpenter and taught him the carpenter trade. And his whole life he loved, he made a bassinet for the first grandbaby, and now every grandbaby gets that when, and now it's been passed on to great grandchildren. A lot of the furniture in their house he built. He was a runner. Whenever his youngest son, Leaf, would kill deer, he fed his family through his own hunting. Eugene would go and butcher it for him because his dad was a butcher, and he never let go of that. And all of those trades and all, I mean, the thing about Eugene is he was deeply human. And I think it's actually one of the things that most compelled me about Eugene is in his person, he pulled things together that we often strip apart. So Eugene was a person of deep holiness. Like when you're with Eugene, I would usually walk away and just get the sense of this man knows God. I don't know what else to say. And it wasn't because of things he said, it was his person. And yet he was also profoundly human. I mean, he loved to laugh, and he loved good food, and he loved beauty and music, and he loved, sometimes he would say things that you wouldn't expect Eugene to say, but it's what a human would do, you know? He loved the sensuality of that place. And I find that a lot of times, you know, we have a hard time pulling these things together. We have something that sort of seems like holiness, but you're like, where's the humanness? And then sometimes we have things that feel really human, but you're like, I'm not sure where the holiness is. And so I think him pulling those things together, a lot of it had to do with there wasn't a separation between him being in the wood shop and him being in the Psalms.
One of the things I remember reading either in his book or maybe it was in the biography was how deeply personal he felt the vocation of pastoral work was. That it couldn't be done well from a figurehead position. There has to be something extremely personal about that, whether that's a hospital visit or a personal visit, or they come to the study, which I have adopted and love, that he never called the place that he worked his office. He always called it his study. But deeply personal. How does, can you say more about that? What did that mean to Eugene, that the pastoral call or vocation needed to be so personal?
Yeah, I mean, it was all about incarnation. Jesus, you know, that passage that most of us know, Jesus moved into the neighborhood. I think that's what bothered him so much about a lot of what he was experiencing in the church in North America is it was becoming less and less personal, and it was becoming more abstract. It's why for his entire life, he would never sign statements, theological statements. He was asked regularly, you know, about this cause or that cause. Even things that he might have agreed with. And his reason was, I'm not called to make statements to nebulous people. I'm called to pastor particular people. And so, and it's why he thought, you know, just for him, the rough number was 500. Like, I don't think I ever should pastor a church over 500 because I can't know the more names than that. And I'm thinking 500 names. Wow. You know, but he could. And it's why themes like friendship and belonging, and it's why he was so resistant to the church becoming a machine that uses people as opposed to being a place where the wheat and the tares grow up together. Yeah.
So last night, I think I heard you interact with someone, and I think something to the effect of that, I know you used to be a pastor, and you corrected them.
Mm-hmm.
You said, I still am.
Right.
And I've often thought that about Eugene. How did he remain a pastor at his core after he retired from Christ the King?
Yeah. You know, I don't think he had to do anything to remain. It's just who he was. Like, he wasn't working at it. It was It was how he bled. It was how he breathed. I think when he was at Regent, he was fundamentally a pastor to those students. It was why he became more and more uncomfortable at Regent, because he felt like he was kind of becoming like a guru. And in fact, one funny thing is, so they had the phones with the voicemails, and this was when things were really starting to blow up in Eugene's world. And one day, or for over a week, he just let the voicemail fill up, and he didn't retrieve any of the messages so that no more messages could get left. And his idea was, if somebody really needs me, they can write me a letter, But I think that wasn't because he was aloof, because he wasn't aloof. It was because he was committed to something else more. And he felt like those, the celebrity, the prominence, the begging for notoriety, the allure of power, that those things were a massive distraction from what he was actually called to do. And when he left Regent, one of the reasons was because he said he feared, what was the way he put it? There might be a mortal wound to his soul if he stayed. He needed to get back to Montana, where nobody would know who he was.
You just said a minute ago that he was committed to something more. Mm-hmm. What is that more?
God. I mean, an awareness of God,
and the guru would have distracted him from that? Is that what you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Because he didn't think it was about God. It was God things with God language, but it was really another way that we inflate our ego and build our kingdoms.
But wouldn't that enlarge his impact in the world? Wouldn't that increase his influence? So the good things and the pastoral way of Eugene, wouldn't that have been amplified?
You have to do Jesus things, Jesus ways.
The ways and means of Jesus.
Yeah.
So let's talk about leadership. How did Eugene feel about leadership in the culture that we're in now and how it's come into the church?
Yeah. He didn't like it. He didn't like the word leadership. Eugene really cared about language. He thought words really matter. And there were times where Eugene thought it was really important to salvage a word, to reanimate it, to give it new breath, because it was too important to let go. There were other times he thought a word had been so distorted and twisted that we needed to find new language. And I think leadership was like that, in that category for him. I think he felt that in the church, when we say leadership, subconsciously even, we immediately download American corporate strategic, go to Barnes & Noble and look at the literature information, and he felt really passionately that was going to prove destructive to the church. He thought it would work. That's the problem. Like it would, if what you're aiming for is to replicate corporate America, then you could. But what you would end up with would no longer be anything like what Jesus had in mind. And so I believe it was the third book of his spiritual theology, the 5-set, the yellow books that came from Erdman's. Jan called them the Peterson Pentateuch. So it's the one that's called the Jesus Way. I would encourage you, if you haven't read a lot of Eugene, I wouldn't start here, but if you want to read some books that we haven't actually heard very well and that haven't detonated. Jesus' Way is one of them. It was before its time. And the other one is one that was first called Earth and Altar, and then got unfortunately reprinted under a much worse title called Where Your Treasure Is. As an aside, Where Your Treasure Is, one of the many criticisms that Eugene got was that he was too quietist, like that he wasn't engaged enough in the real world and the struggles of the world, and he was sort of removed. So he wrote this book called Earth and Altar, and basically was asking the question, how is the church to politically engage? That's might be a relevant question. And his answer was, I bet you one of you, having read, I bet you one of you could tell me what his answer was. I won't do that, but pray. And he goes through 15 Psalms, and they're like detonated. Like you're like, oh my gosh, prayer. It's like Bart talks about prayers. Every time we pray, bend our knees in prayer, we're clasping our hands as part of the revolution. If we understand what prayer is, and if prayer is putting us in a posture and a way of life, the deepest work we do is pray. So it wasn't at all that he thought we shouldn't be engaged. It's that he thought what we were calling engagement was a secondhand counterfeit to what the church is really called to be doing. And if we really did it, everything would be changing about us and the world. And so he wrote The Jesus Way. And The Jesus Way, early on, was actually titled Follow the Leader. It's one of the only times I remember, you can find him using the word leadership every once in a while, but very sparingly, not always in a good light. And The Jesus Way, it got changed to The Jesus Way. And what he does is he confronts, he puts together in opposition the way of Jesus versus every other cultural and political and religious power of Jesus's day. How Jesus was contrary to the way of Caiaphas, how Jesus was contrary to the way of Herod, how Jesus was in contrast to the way of Pilate. And if you read it today, it's like a prophet speaking before his time. And so some people, I think, who don't know Eugene very well or just heard things, kind of quip like, oh, he's the guy who is against mega churches, like offhand. And it's it's fair in some ways, but it's kind of cheap. It wasn't that he had some magical size and he was just opposed to big. It was, his problem was he saw an evangelical religious industry that was, in his language, selling their soul for a pot of porridge. And that in the end, we would be destitute.
Sort of the commodification of the pastoral call, right, where the people that come to church are human resources, right, as opposed to souls.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, and he would also say the problem with a lot of leadership, as we're taught it, is that it works. We said it's efficient, and that's the problem. The gospel is not efficient. The church is not efficient. We go where the pain is. We go where the outcasts are. We take people as they are, and we welcome them, and we sit with them, and we don't move them through a conveyor belt. And if you're going to become efficient, you are inevitably going to leave behind the sheep.
So you said a few moments at the very beginning that this would make Eugene uncomfortable if you were sitting here, this whole conversation, because it's not about him. I remember the Apostle Paul said, "Follow me as I follow Christ." Mm-hmm. And as a pastor, I have to say that there have been many times when I have come across a conundrum in pastoral ministry, and I don't do the WWJD, but I often wonder what Eugene would say here. How would he engage in this particular problem? Mm-hmm. And that's why I think it's important that we have conversations like we're having tonight about a three-dimensional Eugene, not just what we know through his writings. But I find that being able to imagine, based on how much I've read about him, what he would do in a certain, like in 2020 or in political polarization, would be very helpful. So I found that to be a big guide for me.
Yeah.
One of the things that I have loved to do is to disabuse people that Eugene Peterson came up with the phrase, a long obedience in the same direction. And they're often shocked when I tell them that that's a line out of something that Nietzsche wrote. Mm-hmm. And he baptized it, even though he's Presbyterian. Did I say that? I'm a Baptist. When I say baptized, I mean immersed. Anyway. However, that whole idea of a long obedience in the same direction, which is a beautiful descriptor of his life, what do you think is the biggest threat to that kind of long obedience that people in ministry, and specifically in the pastoral vocation, have today?
Just one?
5.
Eugene answered that question specifically. He said that this would have been 10, 12 years ago. He thought ambition and boredom. I do think it looks a little different now. I think those things are still problems. I think ego is definitely still an issue. I don't think we can escape that. I think I would have to add to the list broken hearts. I think it's, for some of us, the last 5 or 6 years, it's been really disheartening to realize where we were. And I can't think of how many times I thought, after having a conversation with someone, or someone was leaving the church, and ego may well have played into that some too, but some of it was just this broken heart of like, I don't know that, I've been your pastor for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. Has it made any difference? Like, it's not about me, but like, have you listened to anything we've said? All the conversations about Jesus and the way of Jesus, and you so easily just chunk it all, I think it's losing heart. So if we could put losing heart with ambition and ego, and I think for some of us, there's really the desire to please. We don't want to maybe it's just me. I don't like to disappoint people. And when I think people have an expectation, I like to deliver it. And when you realize you can't, it's tough.
I had a man call me this week and told me about 4 families that left his church. And they said they've been praying about it for 2 years. And they finally said, we're leaving. And he was just devastated and wept on the phone. And that's a recurring theme in today's culture. You've experienced it. I've experienced it. Every pastor in this room has experienced it. Those leavings really break our hearts. And one of the things that I think I'm curious about is, how did Eugene process? Because that had to have happened to him as well. How did he process that broken heart?
I honestly don't know. We never specifically talked about that. My guess would be he went running. My other guess would be he went out to the woodshed and started doing some stuff. He wrote in his journal. That was the beautiful thing about reading his journal. It's like you got this really unfiltered Eugene. Like, he would talk about people, because it was his free space to do that. It was. I will say, personality-wise, one of the things I just wish I had more of is I didn't get the sense that Eugene struggled with disappointing people the way I do. So I don't know if that particular kind of heartbreak. I think his heartbreak oftentimes was when people were really hurting. And as he got older, and I guess this would have been after Christ our King, I do think there was deep, deep heartbreak about the American church. He couldn't quite believe that it was happening, that we were squandering so much so easily. And I think there was profound consternation and heartbreak around that.
So who today is writing that captures your imagination?
Wendell Berry. Eugene, y'all might remember if you've read much of Eugene, he would often say that if you replace Wendell, if you're reading Wendell and you replace farmer with pastor and farm with parish or church, you pretty much are on target. And so that's why I did my PhD on Berry's fiction, because I was fascinated by that. And when it came time to write the dissertation, I thought, if I have to spend another 3 years reading more theology, I might gouge my eyeballs out. I need some fiction in my life at this point. And so Marilyn Robinson.
By the way, is that why Jayber Crow is the best book about pastoral ministry there is?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's it.
We're done. Have you read Jayber Crow?
Yeah. One of my favorite writers is he died 4 years ago, I think. Kent Huruff, actually, from Salida. Yeah.
So fiction writers would be Wendell Berry. Who else? Anybody?
Marilyn
else?
Robinson.
Marilyn Robinson. Yes.
Kent Huruff. Miska. Who do I love? Rowan Williams. Yes. Yeah.
All right. Well, go ahead. Did you have something else? I'd like to see, what are some questions that you all